Imagine standing in front of 60 people at your grandmother's 90th birthday. You watch your mother hand your sister a diamond engagement ring and your brother a solid gold watch. Then she turns to you with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes and hands you an empty box. The room erupted in laughter. Some people looked away in pity. My mother looked like she'd just performed an act of grace. But under the table, my 90-year-old grandmother's trembling hand slipped a folded note into my palm. 7 words in her handwriting that would dismantle every lie my mother had spent 34 years building. Before I tell you what those 7 words said, stay with me, because this isn't just a story about an empty box. It's about the secret my grandmother kept for 12 years to save me. I still remember that moment like it was happening in slow motion. The weight of that empty box in my hands felt heavier than anything else in the room. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper. It felt like being erased in front of everyone who was supposed to know me. People were smiling, but not kindly. It was the kind of smile people give when they think someone deserves what just happened to them. I looked at my mother. She didn't look guilty. She looked proud, like she had just taught me a lesson I needed to learn. But the truth is, this didn't start that night. It started many years before, in a house where love always had conditions. My name is Ember. I never thought I would become the kind of person who tells their family story to strangers. But sometimes life forces you to speak when silence is no longer safe. I grew up in a family where my mother, Judith, controlled everything without ever needing to raise her voice. She didn't shout to win. She didn't argue to dominate. She simply decided what the truth was, and everyone else adjusted around it. If she said something about you, that became your identity. If she called you difficult, you were difficult. If she called you ungrateful, you were ungrateful. And if she decided you didn't belong, then slowly you stopped belonging. I learned that very early. First, I didn't notice it. When I was a child, everything felt normal. My sister Paige was always the perfect one. My brother Grant was the responsible one. And I was somewhere in between. Not important enough to be praised, but useful enough to be included. But as I grew older, I started seeing the pattern. My mother didn't treat us equally. She managed us like roles in a story she was writing. And every time I questioned something, I became a problem in that story. Everything changed when I was 22. That was the year I discovered something I was never supposed to see. A simple bank withdrawal. $15,000 taken from my grandmother Dorothy's account. First, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe paperwork. Maybe confusion. So I asked my mother. I still remember her expression when I brought it up. Not shock. Not guilt. Just a quick change in tone, like a switch flipping inside her. By the next day, I wasn't Ember who asked a question. I became Ember who causes trouble. She told the family I was confused. She told them I misunderstood things. She even suggested I might be stressed or emotional. And slowly, people stopped listening to me. That is how control works in my family. Not through force, but through rewriting reality until you stop trusting your own memory. The only person who never fell for it was my grandmother, Dorothy. She was different from everyone else. Quiet but not weak. Soft-spoken but sharp in ways people underestimated. When she looked at me, she didn't see the problem child. She saw the truth. And I think that scared my mother more than anything else. After the incident, I started visiting Grandma more often. Every Saturday became my routine. I would mow her lawn, fix small things around her house, and sit with her on the porch while she told me stories from the past. She never rushed me. She never judged me. She just listened. And slowly, without saying it directly, she started teaching me something important. That not everything in the family was what it looked like. There were gaps in her stories. Pauses. Moments where she would stop speaking and just look at me. Like she was waiting for me to understand something she couldn't say out loud. At the time, I didn't understand. But Grandma did. She understood everything. And she was watching more closely than anyone realized. Because in my family, the real power didn't belong to the loudest person. It belonged to the one who kept the records. And my grandmother had been keeping records for a very long time. I just didn't know yet that every Saturday visit, every quiet conversation, And every small act of kindness was leading me toward something my mother could never control again. Something already written in my name. And the night of the 90th birthday would be the moment everything finally started to break open. 3 months before the big birthday celebration, my life already felt like I was walking through a carefully built illusion. On the surface, everything looked normal. My mother was planning a grand 90th birthday party for Grandma Dorothy. She called it a family legacy event. She wanted everything perfect decorations, perfect speeches, perfect photographs that would later be posted and remembered as proof of how loving our family was. But behind the scenes, it was something else entirely. It was control. My mother, Judith, assigned roles like she always did. Paige, my sister, was put in charge of family representation. That meant she would smile for photos, hug guests, and make sure everyone saw her as the golden daughter. My brother Grant was placed in charge of logistics, which meant he handled money and coordination. And me? I was given the jobs that mattered but not the respect that came with them. I was told to handle the caterers, organize seating, and help with the slideshow of Grandma's life. Everything that required real work but nothing that required recognition. When I asked if I could give a short speech about Grandma, my mother didn't even look at me for a full second. She just said, "You're not close enough to her for that." The words were simple, but they were designed to cut deep. I didn't argue. I learned long ago that arguing with my mother was like trying to fight fog. You never win and you only get lost. So I nodded and stepped back. But inside something was changing, because I knew something she didn't. I was closer to Grandma than anyone else in that room would ever be willing to admit. While Paige posted pictures online of bonding time she barely spent, and Grant visited only when it was convenient, I was there every Saturday without fail. No audience. No photos. No performance. Just real time. I would arrive early in the morning. Grandma Dorothy always opened the door before I even knocked. It was like she was waiting for me. She never asked why I came so often. She already knew. Instead, she would hand me tea, and we would sit in the same worn chairs near the window. Sometimes she talked about the past, about my grandfather, about the land, about things that once mattered to this family before money and pride took over. Other times, she just watched me work in her garden. Those were the quietest moments. But somehow they meant the most, because in those moments I felt seen. Not as a problem, not as a mistake, just as Ember. But something started to shift about 2 months before the party. Grandma began acting differently. She became more thoughtful, more observant. She would pause mid-sentence and study my face as if she was memorizing it. Sometimes she would ask strange questions. "Do you trust your memory?" she once asked me. I laughed lightly, thinking it was just an old person's philosophical question. "Yes," I said. "Why wouldn't I?" But she didn't smile back. She just said, "Good. Hold on to that." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. Now I realize she was preparing me, not emotionally, but practically, because something important was already in motion. 2 weeks before the birthday, Grandma asked me something I would never forget. It was a normal Saturday visit. I was in the garden, trimming plants, when she came outside holding a small envelope. She said, "We need to go somewhere." I asked where. She didn't answer. She just said, "The bank." The drive was quiet. She didn't talk much, which was unusual. Usually she filled silence with stories. But that day she just stared out the window like she was watching something only she could see. When we arrived, she didn't ask for help getting out of the car. She walked straight inside like she had done it 1,000 times before. Inside, everything felt ordinary, quiet, controlled, official. A bank is one of those places where people assume nothing emotional can happen. But that day, something very emotional was being locked into place. Grandma spoke to a bank officer for a while. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught words like authorization, access, and safety deposit box. Then she turned to me, and that was the moment everything changed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small brass key. It looked old, not decorative, not symbolic, real. She placed it in my hand. and said 7 words that I didn't fully understand at the time. Keep this in case you need it. I looked at the key confused. Need it for what? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed her hand over mine. Her grip was stronger than I expected. Then she said something else, softer this time. Some things in this family are not what they seem. And one day you will need proof. I felt something shift inside me, but I still didn't understand the full weight of it. I thought it was just family concern, maybe inheritance planning, maybe old memories being organized. I had no idea that what she had just given me wasn't just a key. It was access, not just to a box, but to a truth that had been hidden for over a decade. That night, I kept the key in my drawer. And for the first time, I noticed something strange. My grandmother didn't look worried. She looked ready, like someone who had been waiting a very long time for a moment she already knew would come. And somewhere deep down, I felt it too. That the birthday party wasn't just going to be a celebration. It was going to be a reveal. I just didn't know yet that I was the one holding the piece that would unlock everything. The day of the 90th birthday arrived faster than I expected. It came with the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath before something important happens. From early morning, the house was already alive with activity. Cars were arriving. Flowers were being arranged. Tables were being set with perfect white cloths and golden decorations that looked expensive but emotionless. Everything was designed to look like love, but I knew my family well enough to understand that appearances were their favorite language. And today, my mother Judith was the director of it all. She moved through the event like a queen inspecting her kingdom. Every detail passed through her approval. Every smile had to match her vision. Even laughter felt controlled, like people were afraid to laugh the wrong way. Paige was already performing her role perfectly. She hugged guests too tightly, laughed a little too loudly, and made sure her phone camera captured every moment. She looked like she belonged in every picture, every frame, every memory. Grant stayed close to important guests, shaking hands, talking business, pretending to be the responsible son. Everyone respected. And me? I was invisible in plain sight. I moved quietly behind the scenes, checking arrangements, fixing last-minute issues, making sure everything worked smoothly. People spoke to me only when they needed something, and looked past me when they didn't. That was always my place in this family. Useful but not important. Present but not acknowledged. But something inside me was different that day. Because in my pocket, I carried the brass key Grandma had given me. And every time I felt its weight, I remembered her words. Some things are not what they seem. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I could feel it building. As the afternoon passed, guests began to gather for the main event. The ballroom was breathtaking. Chandeliers reflected soft golden light across perfectly arranged tables. A giant portrait of Grandma Dorothy stood at the center, surrounded by flowers. Everyone looked impressed. Everyone except me, because I could feel something under the surface, like a story about to crack open. Then the speeches began. My mother stepped forward first. She tapped the microphone lightly, and the room slowly went quiet. And when Judith spoke, her voice changed. It always did. She didn't just speak, she performed. She talked about legacy, about family strength, about the importance of honoring those who carry the name forward. People listened like she was telling truth itself. But I knew better. Because I had lived long enough inside her version of truth to recognize how carefully it was constructed. Then she smiled. That specific smile. The one she used when something cruel was about to feel justified. Now, she said warmly, it's time for gifts. The room reacted with excitement. Gift giving in my family was never simple. It was a statement. A ranking system disguised as celebration. Paige was called first. My mother walked over to her with a small velvet box. Inside was a diamond engagement ring. The room reacted instantly. Gasps. Applause. Admiration. Paige covered her mouth like she was overwhelmed, even though I knew she had expected it. Next, Grant was called. He received a solid gold watch. Again applause. Respect. Approval. 2 children rewarded. 2 roles confirmed. Then came the pause. That moment of silence where everyone unconsciously knew something else was coming. My mother turned her head slowly and looked directly at me. The entire room shifted. I felt it immediately. 60 people focusing on one person at the same time feels like pressure you can physically touch. Judith walked toward me slowly, each step deliberate, each pause controlled, and then she held out her hand, and it was a small box. Worn, old, no ribbon, no decoration. It didn't even look like it belonged in the same category as the others. She smiled at me gently, but it wasn't kindness. It was execution. "For you, sweetheart," she said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear. The box it all came in. A few people laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Then she added, "Since you always said material things don't matter." That line, it was perfect. It made her look generous, and made me look ungrateful in advance. For a second I didn't move. My face felt hot. My chest tightened. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the room. This was not a mistake. This was designed. She had planned this moment carefully. To reduce me. To define me. To finish the story she had been writing about me for years. I looked at the box. Then at her. She was smiling like she had already won. I could feel every eye in the room waiting for my reaction. Waiting for embarrassment. Waiting for me to break. My fingers closed around the box slowly. It felt light. Empty. Almost meaningless. And that was the point. I heard a few whispers in the crowd. A few suppressed laughs. Someone looked away like they felt uncomfortable, but not enough to stop watching. Then I felt something else. A hand under the table. Grandma Dorothy. Her fingers touched mine briefly. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. But it was steady. Like an anchor. And in that small moment, something inside me stabilized. I inhaled slowly, looked at my mother, and instead of reacting the way she expected, I smiled. I lifted my head slightly and said 2 words. "Thank you." The room didn't know what to do with that response. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't defeat. It was something else entirely. And for the first time that night, I saw something flicker in my mother's expression. Not victory. Uncertainty. After I said thank you, the room slowly returned to noise. People started clapping again, but it didn't feel real anymore. It felt automatic, like they were trying to fill a silence they didn't understand. My mother, Judith, smiled as if everything had gone exactly the way she planned. But I noticed something small in her expression now. A slight tension behind her eyes. Not fear yet. Not regret. Just control being tested for the first time. The rest of the evening continued like nothing unusual had happened. Music played. People ate. Conversations resumed. But for me, something had already shifted. The empty box was still in my hands, resting lightly on my lap, but it no longer felt like humiliation. Felt like a signal. A message I didn't understand yet. And I kept thinking about Grandma's hand under the table. That small, steady touch. Like she was telling me without words. Wait. I stayed through the dinner, though I barely tasted anything. My mind was no longer in that ballroom. It was somewhere deeper, circling around the brass key in my pocket and the strange calm in Grandma's eyes earlier that day. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't disturbed. She looked like someone who had already accepted the outcome of a story that was still unfolding. When the speeches ended and guests began to relax, I quietly stepped away from the main hall. No one stopped me. In fact, no one really noticed. That was the strange part about being invisible in your own family. You can leave a room full of people and still feel like you were never really there. I walked down a quiet corridor toward the restroom, the sound of the celebration fading behind me. The walls were lined with framed family photographs. Smiling moments. Perfect moments. Carefully selected memories that told a very specific story about who we were. A story I was never fully part of. Inside the restroom, I finally closed the door and leaned against the counter. For the first time all night, I allowed myself to breathe properly. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from sadness. from pressure, because something inside me was telling me that this wasn't just humiliation. It was a setup, but for what I didn't yet know. Slowly, I pulled the small envelope Grandma had slipped into my hand earlier from my pocket. It was simple, folded paper, nothing special to anyone else, but to me it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. I unfolded it carefully. 7 words. Just 7. Written in her familiar handwriting. My eyes scanned them once, then again, and something in my chest tightened. Everything real is already in your name. I didn't move for a few seconds, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I felt them deeply, like they weren't just information, they were confirmation. My mind immediately tried to find logic, legal meaning, symbolic meaning, anything that would make it simple, but nothing about it felt simple. Everything real is already in your name. What did that mean? The house? The land? The accounts? The family assets? Or something else entirely? My thoughts raced back to the brass key, the safety deposit box, the bank visit, Grandma's calm voice, her warning, and suddenly I felt a shift. Like pieces I hadn't realized were scattered were now starting to align. I didn't go back to the party immediately. Instead, I stood there for a long time just holding the note, because I realized something important in that moment. My grandmother wasn't guessing. She wasn't hoping. She knew. And knowledge like that doesn't come from emotion. Comes from preparation. When I finally stepped out of the restroom, I didn't return to the main hall right away. Instead, I walked slowly toward a quieter part of the building where staff members moved in and out carrying trays and cleaning up after the event. And that's when I saw her, Grandma Dorothy, sitting alone in a side room slightly away from the noise. She looked calm, too calm for someone at the center of a 90th birthday celebration. When she saw me, she didn't ask what happened. She already knew. I walked toward her and sat down beside her carefully. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she placed her hand over mine again, the same steady pressure. And this time I felt something different in it. Not comfort, not reassurance, but certainty, like she was anchoring me to something solid before a storm arrived. "You read it," she said softly. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something that changed the way I understood everything I had lived through. "Your mother likes stories," she said quietly, "but she never checks who owns the truth behind them." I didn't fully understand what she meant yet, but I was about to, because 2 days after that night, I would meet the person who held the legal key to everything. And the truth about the empty box would finally begin to reveal itself. 2 days after the birthday party, I met the man who would change everything. His name was Thomas Calloway, my grandmother's longtime attorney. He didn't look dramatic or intimidating like lawyers in movies. He looked calm, controlled, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks. We met in a quiet office downtown, away from the noise of the family, away from the story my mother had built for years. When I sat down, I didn't even know what question to ask first. I just placed the brass key on the table. Thomas looked at it once, and then he looked at me. "I was expecting you," he said. Those words made my stomach tighten, not because they were strange, but because they sounded planned, like I was never part of a surprise. I was part of a timeline. He opened a thick file and placed it in front of me. My name was on the first page. Ember Atwood. Not as a footnote, not as a side mention, but as the primary beneficiary of something I had never been told existed. Then he started explaining. 12 years ago, my grandmother Dorothy had made a decision, a legal decision, not emotional, not temporary, permanent. She had transferred ownership of the entire family estate into an irrevocable trust. In my name, everything, the 40-acre property, the financial assets, the family land that had been in generations, even the valuable personal collection that my mother always referred to as family jewelry. But there was more. Thomas leaned forward slightly as he spoke, as if emphasizing each word carefully. "Your mother," he said, has not owned anything she has been controlling for years. I stared at him, not fully understanding yet. He continued. Legally, she was managing assets she believed were hers. But they were never hers to begin with. My mind struggled to process it, because in my mother's world, ownership was never questioned. She spoke like everything belonged to her by right. She controlled decisions, money, events, even people. But what Thomas was saying was different. She had been managing an illusion of control. And then he explained the part that made my hands go cold. The gifts, the ring, the watch, the special family heirlooms my mother had proudly distributed at the birthday party. He opened another document and said, "Those items are not real." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean not real?" He didn't hesitate. "They are high-quality replicas. Cubic zirconia, plated metals, designed to look valuable, not be valuable." For a moment I didn't even react. My brain refused to accept it immediately, because it wasn't just about fake jewelry. It was about intention. My mother hadn't just been wrong. She had been performing control with fake symbols of power. Thomas continued. "Your grandmother discovered years ago that funds were being misused. Instead of confronting it directly, she began restructuring everything quietly." He paused. "And she made one decision that changed everything." I leaned forward slightly. "What decision?" He closed the file and said the words that finally made everything click into place. "She decided your mother should never know she had already lost." Silence filled the room, and suddenly I understood the true meaning of the empty box. It was never a joke. It was never humiliation aimed at me. It was evidence. My mother thought she was giving me nothing, but she was actually revealing her own ignorance, because she didn't know the real distribution of power had already been completed years ago. That night at the birthday, while everyone laughed at me, they were laughing inside a story they didn't understand. A story where the ending had already been written. I left Thomas's office in silence. The city felt different as I walked outside. Not louder, not brighter, just clearer. Like something that had been blurred for years was finally coming into focus. In the days that followed, the truth didn't stay hidden for long. Doesn't in small towns. Word travels faster than control can keep up. First, my sister Paige went to a jeweler to resize her diamond ring. She came back shaken. It wasn't diamond. It was glass. Then Grant checked his gold watch. It wasn't gold. It was a $40 imitation. And suddenly, the pride my mother had built that night started collapsing in pieces. Not because someone attacked her, but because reality stopped cooperating with her version of it. People began talking. Questions began forming. And for the first time, my mother couldn't fully control the narrative. Then came the phone call. I was at home when it rang. I already knew before I answered. Her voice was sharp, unstable, accusatory. "What did you do?" she shouted. "You switched everything. You embarrassed this family." I listened quietly. Then I said something calmly. "I didn't switch anything." A pause. Then I added, "Call Grandma." And I hung up. That was the moment her control finally cracked. Not from anger, not from confrontation, but from confusion. Because for someone like my mother, the worst thing that can happen isn't being challenged. It's not understanding what's happening anymore. Weeks later, the estate began to stabilize under my name. Quietly, legally, without drama. And my mother lost something far more important than money. She lost authority over the story. Today I live on that land. The same 40 acres that once felt like a battleground of identity now feels like peace. I turned the barn into my studio. I build landscapes the way I wish my life had been built earlier. Carefully, with space to grow. And the empty box sits on my shelf, not as humiliation, not as pain, but as proof. Because I finally understand what my grandmother gave me that day. She didn't give me revenge. She didn't give me validation. She gave me truth at the exact moment I needed it most. My mother gave me an empty box to make me feel like nothing. But my grandmother gave me 7 words that proved I was never nothing at all. And sometimes the most powerful inheritance isn't what people see. It's what they never saw coming.